At 9:30, we'd now like to move on to our first presentation, and it's on the devolution of new powers, new powers at local government level, debates, proposals, and experience. I would like to welcome Dr. Mark Callanan, who is one of Ireland's greatest experts in local government, and we don't use those terms lightly. So it's a privilege to have Mark with us this morning. He's an author, and his recent publication, Local Government in Ireland, 2018, and he's going to talk us over the next 20 minutes. We'll follow that by a round table discussion and a Q&A with Mark. So I'm really looking forward to this. Please welcome Dr. Mark Callanan.
So, thanks very much. You can hear me okay, everyone. Thanks very much, Jim, for the invitation to speak here this morning. It's really a great honour for me to be asked to speak to this group, especially in the area of local government reform. And apart from anything else, as somebody remarked to me this morning looking at the agenda, I'm the warm-up act for a former Taoiseach, so that's a new one for me anyway. But I'm hoping I have something interesting to say and something that helps make a contribution in terms of your own deliberations and to say as well, I'm in admiration of you coming together on a regular basis on giving up your sunny weekends, given that we're into June, almost July, and I know local government isn't always the most exciting of issues, maybe except for strange people like me, but hopefully, and I've been looking back on some of the recordings, hopefully getting more and more acquainted, and as Jim I think said this morning, this is really a fantastic chance for you to make your mark on Dublin for generations to come, because ultimately, you know, Dublin as residents of the city and county, it's something that belongs to all of us, and I think it's great that we've got a representative sample of people, a cross-section of people living in the area to sort of come together and think through different options for the future of Dublin. I should also say, before getting into the presentation, I'm just here as again, looking back on video recordings, Jim has mentioned, free citizens. I'm just here as a free citizen of Dublin. I'm not here representing the views of my employer or any other organisation. I'm just here on my own bat, so to speak. But I've been asked by the chair to talk to you this morning about functions and the potential devolution of functions at that more localised level, as a way of maybe providing a bit of context to your own particular deliberations around proposals that you might want to put forward. And I think it might be worth as well clarifying what do we mean by devolution, because I think there is a couple of dimensions to devolution that I think are worth bearing in mind when we talk about devolution. And we also need to get the word decentralisation out of the way as well, because in Ireland we have a kind of uniquely Irish way of thinking about decentralisation. When most people talk about decentralisation, they're talking about, in the Irish context anyway, talking about relocating civil servants outside of Dublin. And that's a label that's sort of stuck to a programme of relocating. And whatever we think about that, if you talk to people from other parts of the world about decentralisation, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about devolving the power to make decisions at that more, either at a regional or a local level. So I suppose devolution is perhaps a more helpful word to use in the Irish context when we're sort of talking about, and I think that's the context in which you're really looking at in terms of elected office holders assuming responsibility for a particular service area or a particular area of responsibility and having some element of autonomy and discretion. And when we think about devolution and levels of devolved systems on the one hand or more centralised systems on the other, I think there's a couple of different dimensions that are worth bearing in mind to that. So first and foremost, we might be talking about the range of responsibilities that exist at a more localised level. But very often quite closely associated with that might be the question of fiscal autonomy, and I know that's a part of your programme for this weekend, so the ability and the discretion for elected office holders to raise money to do certain things, and the two very often go hand in hand. There may also be a dimension around devolution, around discretion. what element of discretion exists to adapt services to maybe particular circumstances that exist in local areas. How much intervention does national government, how much intervention is there by national government in a particular service area? So these are different, I suppose, dimensions to devolution that I think are worth bearing in mind. And the other thing I think that's worth saying is it's always been a bit of a curiosity of mine that, or a paradox if you like, that in Ireland I think we do have a fairly acute sense of attachment to place, to locality, where we're from. Right? Survey data would tend to show that by international standards, by international comparisons, that there would be quite an intense, most Irish people would, have a fairly intense sense of where they come from. And it's even, you see it in small talk, what do two Irish people when they meet each other, what's the first bit of small talk, where are you from, right? It's kind of it's one of those generic things that were kind of hardwired into us. But yet we have that sort of sense of attachment to locality on the one hand, but it's never really carried over to much in the way of a public debate around devolution. What are the things that what are the decisions we could make at a more localised level? And that's always been a strange thing for me. Why have we not had that debate? So I think it's great that the Citizens' Assembly are really dwelling on this issue. So. Briefly, as I said, I'm going to just try and provide a bit of context to some of these issues and maybe chew over a couple of standard arguments you might come across in terms of why should we do certain things at a national level and why might we do certain things at a more devolved level, either at a regional or a local level. So what are some of the standard arguments in existing research that exist around these kinds of debates? Maybe some examples, but I sort of skimmed through those fairly quickly because I know last week you had some international examples. I suppose there was more maybe an emphasis, my sense was more an emphasis on structure, so I might talk particularly about what are the things that are devolved, subject to devolved decision making in other similar contexts to Dublin. And maybe looking at some previous proposals on devolution, because we have been here before, some examples of things that have been devolved, but other things that have been proposed but haven't been devolved. So some of the standard arguments that you might find around, why might we do certain things at a national level, right? So I think the first thing you often hear, particularly maybe in the occasional Irish debates around this topic is, we're a small country, right? So devolution might be all well and good for big countries or very big countries, but, sure, aren't we all small? And, okay, we're getting a bit bigger, crossing the 5 million threshold, as the CSO have told us this week. But that's a kind of a standard argument. I mean, nobody can argue that, it is a factual thing that, we are a small country, but whether that's a reason for a relatively centralised system of government, that I think is more open to debate. And you would see, I suppose, a couple of other arguments around ensuring a consistency and uniformity. So there may be certain service areas where we might place a particular value on ensuring everyone is treated exactly the same across the entire territory of the state, is treated equitably. And that certainly might be important with regard to areas, for example, in terms of citizens' rights, for example, or judicial protection, that we might expect everyone to be treated the same, right? So that might be less so for other things. In some extent, that comes down to value judgments. We might come back to that in just a second. Can help promote equity and redistribution, so it can address maybe regional inequalities. So national provision can help redistribute funds from richer areas to poorer areas. And I suppose taking those two arguments together, you might sort of say national government might naturally take the lead in certain areas like macroeconomic policies, the redistribution agenda, to some extent around certain service areas like defence and things like that, naturally maybe lend themselves to national provision. We might think about economic arguments around scale. Certain responsibilities might require a critical mass or population threshold. That's usually, by the way, less than most people might assume. And as you probably heard already as well, Irish local authorities already are quite large by international standards. So we can get too head up. I mean, there's some research into this in the Irish context, but certain service areas might lend themselves to a larger scale, particularly more infrastructure-based services, whereas more person-to-person services have less scale effects, and so there would be economic arguments around what things might suit provision at a national or regional or at a local level. A national approach might facilitate a sort of a clear focus for decision making. With the more devolved systems, you got more checks and balances, whereas maybe it's clear in national approaches around who's ultimately responsible for what. So decision making can be more complicated in more devolved systems, and national provision might help in terms of managing budgets, maybe balancing our books, so to speak. It can make or devolved systems, there might be an argument around devolved systems making budgetary management slightly more complicated, although again the research would be a bit patchy on this in terms of whether subnational authorities are more spendthrift than national authorities. The evidence isn't conclusive on that front. So certain arguments then around a more devolved approach, reflecting diversity that exists. So local areas differ according to population levels, population densities, socioeconomic profiles, environmental conditions, skills needs in terms of the labour force, labour market conditions. So notwithstanding the fact that Ireland is a small country, we do have quite a lot of diversity around some of these things. To put it bluntly, the needs of employers in West Dublin, for example, are unlikely to be exactly the same as the needs of employers in East Mayo. Right? So we do have diversity in terms of local areas, and I suppose more devolved approaches can facilitate adapting services to maybe suit the needs and circumstances that might exist in different areas. And indeed, the future might be suggest the future is going to be characterised by more diversity into the future. So climate change models, for example, suggest that the impacts of climate change are likely to be quite localised. Proximity to watercourses, coastal areas, drier summers for some, wetter, stormier winters for others, that even in a small country like Ireland, we might expect to see the future being characterised by a little bit more diversity than maybe that we have in the present. The idea of local government being able to be a closer level of service provision, being more responsive to the citizen, does it open up more avenues for participation? And there would be some statistical information, some research suggesting, maybe not necessarily surprisingly so, that, for example, participation in elections at local level tends to be higher in more devolved systems. So the greater range of services that are decided at a local level, that tends to encourage greater interest in what's happening at that level. There are also sometimes arguments made around having a closer link between what citizens get in terms of service levels and what they pay in terms of things like charges and local taxes, that can have positive financial effects as opposed to national provision of services where it's one pot of money, and that can encourage what economists sometimes call fiscal illusion. Can mean that there's a more natural variety, there's greater innovation, greater prospects for innovation at a local level. We can experiment more, we can try different things out in different areas. It can maybe help reduce the overload that can exist at national government. So rather than national government being preoccupied with the minutiae of service provision, it can allow national government to get on with national issues. Sometimes I suppose a criticism levelled at the Irish system, and that perhaps maybe reduce the need for having multiple local level delivery structures, but so consolidating more things within the local government system, ultimately accountable to elected office holders, that this can reduce the need for multiple channels of delivery, as well as maybe in more democratic arguments around having an element of checks and balances and the potential for abuse of power at national government in more devolved systems. So you've already seen, I suppose, the sort of you've had an overview around the current services provided by the existing local government system within Dublin. So you've probably seen a version of this slide here already, and within these kind of headline areas, there's there's a range of different sub-services and programs and things like that. So these are really the sort of the headline areas. And when people like me come up on podiums like this and sort of say, you know, Ireland has a very narrow range of functions, I think we shouldn't overlook the often undervalued things that the existing local government system already does. Some things that are often taken for granted and maybe underappreciated. So you have a range of different things reflected on the list here. But I suppose it is to make the observation, that's generally well accepted, I think, that in other jurisdictions there's a sort of a wider ambit taken, that there's a wider range of responsibilities that are decided at that more local level. So I've just tried to capture, I suppose, some of the existing things that are done at local level here in Ireland, but some of the additional things that are done at a local level in other jurisdictions, in sort of in a more visual form. So some of the things there are crossovers with the existing system here in Ireland, things like the fire service, for example, road maintenance, water treatment and supply, although of course that's in transition to Irish Water, but local authorities still doing a lot of the day-to-day work there under service level agreements with Irish Water, environmental services and things like that as well. But you can see, if you look at other jurisdictions, a range of other things that would tend to be done at that local or city-wide level in other parts of the world. So education, for example, schools and different levels of involvement in schools and education in different jurisdictions, but that would be one, certainly one area. Childcare, primary or community healthcare services. So those would be things in a non-hospital environment. So things that don't involve going to a hospital. Very often they might be run through the local government system. Social welfare services, things like care of the elderly, things like that. And in some parts of the world as well, North America, some European countries, you might have a municipal or a local police force as well, to be under the responsibility of a mayor. So I know you've had a little bit of this in terms of international comparisons in other parts of the world, but one way of, I suppose, providing a snapshot of the difference between Ireland on the one hand and other countries would be looking at the breakdown of the public service workforce. So drawing on OECD figures, when we add up all the people who are paid through the public purse, what proportion of those individuals are employed through central national government, in our case through government departments or state agencies, and what proportion of the workforce is employed through the local government system or the regional government system. And forget about the big countries, right? I probably should have edited this chart a little bit better. We can, let's forget about big countries for the moment. But even if we think of sort of similarly sized countries, we can see a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of service provision actually takes place at that more devolved level. So I suppose that's just a way of sort of capturing that difference that exists between different countries, including similarly smaller sized countries. And I thought it was great that you had a chance to sort of talk firsthand to a number of different representatives from different systems last time round. I just have a couple of slides very quickly I'm going to run through, and I'm not going to dwell on these, but just giving a profile of larger cities in smaller states. So if we were looking at benchmarks for Dublin, we might sort of say, well, Dublin is a big city with a hinterland in a small-sized state. So we could look at, similarly large states in small-sized countries, and what are the things that are delivered through the local government system in other parts of the world. So in Helsinki in Finland, for example, some of the same things that are done at local government levels, but some additional things as well in terms of primary education, childcare, the disbursement of social welfare benefits. So just to be clear there, local councils in Helsinki don't change the state pension, they don't change unemployment benefit, they don't change child benefit. That's their standardised rates, but they administer those. So you go to your local town hall to in your dealings with the social welfare system instead of having a network of separate offices. And then regulating public transport might be another one. So as well as the sort of the road maintenance and traffic management function, you know, how does public transport work in the city and across the city? A similar sort of profile if you look at Amsterdam, for example, in the Netherlands. Some slight differences, but I suppose a similar enough profile. And then just to take, I suppose, a more narrow range of functions, maybe something closer to what we have here in Ireland. I've just taken Auckland in New Zealand as another example. Again, large city in a small size state where maybe it's a little bit closer to what we do here. So obviously looking elsewhere, we can get lots of ideas in terms of potential candidates for devolution. But I suppose we've also got our experience from previous proposals as well around devolution. And I could go back into the depths of history here. Even the 1990s is probably old hat at this stage. But I suppose a range of proposals that have been out there around devolution. So two groups that were established in the 1990s by government at the time. One, an expert advisory committee, and the second, a devolution committee in the devolution commission in the mid-1990s, made a series of proposals and identified a number of candidate areas that could be devolved to the local level around education, childcare, community healthcare, social welfare, public transport, tourism, and maybe some input into local policing. So a more recent initiative was the Putting People First programme for local government reform. I suppose that's the last major reform programme around the local government system. And there you did have some examples of new services and programmes being devolved to the local level. So providing support through the local enterprise offices, the LEOs, as they're known, economic development and enterprise supports, and through service level agreements with Enterprise Ireland. An oversight role, a financial oversight role for local government around community development funding and things like that. So we have some examples in the past where powers have been devolved. I suppose a recurring theme through these initiatives would tend to be this idea that there's a logistical exercise required if new powers and responsibilities are being devolved to the local level. That has to be accompanied by an assessment of what are the financial implications, what are the personnel implications around new responsibilities being devolved. But I think that's a logistical exercise that can happen and has, you know, happened in those examples that have been devolved in the past. So I think, you know, just by way of finishing, Chair, just to say, I think the decision for this group as a citizens' assembly really comes down to, around proposals around devolution anyway, really comes down to value judgments that you might, you know, have amongst the group itself, and particularly the choice around which of the areas of service provision that you think, well, actually, we should have a pretty much a uniform approach across the country, and maybe that's more appropriate for national provision. And then on the other hand, which of the service areas where you might say, well, actually, Dublin is different. Dublin is different to other parts of the country, and the circumstances of Dublin are different to other parts of the country, and that maybe that is a candidate and a reasonable area where we might look at more devolved decision making, where we might need to tweak and adjust and change our approach to service provision, depending on the differences that exist in Dublin compared to other parts of the country. So I hope that's helpful to you, and I know we have a discussion and Q&A session, but I'll finish there and wish you all the best in your deliberations. Thanks very much.